realize how dense this stuff is.
And we have more empathy for you with having to write this report.
We spent a lot of time yesterday on cannabis and finance.
I bet you did.
So it's so similar from the motivating factors to do this, to the structural, organizational, to the licensing fees, and if we're going to do this year, we're going to have to figure out a way to simplify it a little bit and to delegate a lot. So
yeah,
there's too many decisions here for a legislature like us to deal with in this short time frame. I guess we were live. I'm sorry. So if everybody heard that, they'll know what we're up against. Okay, Tucker, back at you.
All right. Well, to bring us back, we had just talked about riverboat gambling, and again, to demonstrate just how broad your choices are in Vermont, you do have the 6th largest lake in the United States on your shores. So riverboat gambling could be on the table. So
exactly. And all those New York Staters
just lost my vote.
We'll just call it icebreaker gambling.
Well, then we have the drinks to go with it for real.
Exactly. I was making a little pun there.
Yeah. Good work there, Pro Tem.
So moving on from all of those essential or basic licensing issues, within the licensing structure, you get into some very complicated and technical regulatory requirements, the minimum bases for which are usually set by statute. And then you have a delegated regulatory structure where an administrative agency oversees those minimum requirements. So to touch upon them briefly, every license-based state has adopted minimum security requirements through statute and delegated that to an executive branch agency, typically the Gaming Control Agency. The security requirements provide, for example, minimum standards for physical and digital resources, financial resources, the integrity of gaming devices such as servers and kiosks, and the protection of system and patron data. And I'll pause there because data is the bleeding edge of sports betting regulatory markets in 2 ways. First, the protection of your wagerers' data as they're interacting, particularly with Senator Clarkson, the internet-based systems. You have a lot of data collection, including personally identifiable information. Most of these systems, for example, require the use of a social security number to create the account. Then on the other side of data, within the gaming system, you have to have some way of confirming the outcome of particular wagers. And that is all reliant on certified data systems. So how do you know whether a particular athlete performed up to the level of the bet where you're paying out the wager? Patrick Mahomes is going to throw for 300 yards in this game, yes or no? Well, you have to have a way of certifying that particular discrete result if you're going to allow those sorts of parlay or in-game bets in your system. And some locations have taken a step towards specifically regulating and licensing the use of official data. And the reason for that step is that professional sporting organizations have stepped forward in many states to say that they want to provide the certified and official data. Something to keep in mind as you move forward, perhaps something for an administrative agency to take a look at later on. But if you want to build it into the licensing scheme, you may have to make room for it when you're putting together your statutory framework.
And I'll just remind us all that this has a big interplay with our data privacy work that will be coming, that's starting in the House, that will be coming here.
And in this emerging theme, Senator Clarkson, I think this is another one of your favorites, but many states are looking towards blockchain technology for a lot of this
Right.
certification.
Yeah, and protection.
Right. Additionally, within the security theme for these statutory frameworks in each of the states, every state requires the monitoring of wagers and wagering activity, primarily for the purpose of identifying irregularities, either with an individual wager or with a series of wagers. And there's reporting requirements both to the state and to the professional sporting organizations. On one side for wager security and gaming security, and on the other side for the next important pillar of any sports betting regulatory structure, but particularly for licensing, which is integrity systems. And until I took the deep dive on sports betting regulation in all of the states, I didn't realize how important a role integrity systems play. And I included this in some of the appendices, and I'll send it to you all when the report comes in. There's a lot of research that's been done out of the University of Nevada, Las Vegas Law Journal that investigates building good integrity systems through legislative framework and your administrative rules. So baseline integrity systems, these are measures that include the prohibition of wagers by particular people. The most common prohibited wagerers are athletes, coaches, managers, and team owners. Referees are another commonly prohibited wagerer. In addition, often the employees of the sports betting operator. So for example, an individual employee of, let's say, DraftKings would be prohibited. And the reason for that is it would go against the integrity of the system because they might have some specialized knowledge. They might have knowledge that's not available to the general public, similar to like insider trading. There's a growing trend in the states. Not all states have this, but the more recently adopted models do. And that is an option for in-state athletic associations, teams, and educational corporations, your universities, to request of the agency that a particular event or series of events be prohibited from the sports betting market. So for example, in a given state, you might have that state's Major League Baseball team reach out and say that for this particular playoff game, we've identified some sort of irregularity. We don't want any wagering on this game. Please prohibit your sports betting operators from offering wagers on this game. I'll quickly move through the next two, which is record keeping and reporting. Every state in their statutes has some sort of minimum record keeping requirement. Typically, these are financial records, and the certification of what are known as house rules or internal controls, or both, for the sports betting operators. These are rules for the play of a particular game that's allowed within the statutory framework. They have to be determined ahead of time, and they have to be posted so that the players know what the rules are when they're placing their wager. In addition, internet-based gaming, you have the requirement for keeping logs of the transactions that are being made. So that's where you get into some of that sensitive data about your individual wagerer. Land-based, you have similar requirements in states. Once a wagerer gets to a certain dollar amount within a 24-hour period, they're going to be keeping an analog record daily of those wagers that then gets reported into a centralized system. And
Senator Clarkson.
Thanks. To that point, if it was state-based control, could it then also cut off at a certain dollar amount so that individuals don't game their lives away? I mean, is there any kind of
I'll jump right to it. I'll skip over the reporting requirements. Quickly note, almost every state requires some sort of annual report that's based on the information gathered from the licensees. It goes in some states to the governor, in some states to the General Assembly, but you essentially get an annual audit of the transactions within the state for the year. Senator Clarkson, some states have established very comprehensive, responsible gaming mechanisms. Connecticut is one of those states, and Connecticut, on their internet-based gaming platforms, they have built-in triggers that cue the player once they've reached a certain dollar amount to know you have wagered this amount in this amount of time. Maybe it's time for a cooling off period. They have notices about taking breaks from wagering. And they have a comprehensive system for posting notices or potentially interrupting mobile-based play once you've hit one of those threshold triggers. And within that context, and I am right near the end here, every state has some form of minimum responsible gaming requirement. In some states, it's simply the posting of a notice every time you open your mobile app, or potentially when you're at the retail location, there has to be posted signs about responsible gaming. Typically, the minimum requirement is the posting of a hotline for responsible gaming. There's a mechanism in nearly every state for self-exclusion. So you can request that the state keep you on a list of people who should not have access to the system. And you are excluded then from being able to place wagers until you request to be taken off. Some states are far more comprehensive. I just touched on Connecticut because Senator Clarkson very astutely anticipated where some of this was going. Connecticut also requires that each one of its licensees, in addition to the fees and the taxes that they may pay, that they donate $500,000 a year to a responsible gaming entity of their choice. That's a component of their licensure in the state of Connecticut. Last thing to cover, and I'm sure it will be the most complicated and robust part of your discussions moving forward, taxation. Every state taxes the adjusted gross wagering receipts of their licensed entities. Adjustments or deductions are typically limited to payouts within a certain reporting period. But there are states that have some interesting staggered deduction periods. So for example, for the first 5 years that a licensee is introducing a product within a particular state, I believe Colorado is one of these states, they are allowed to deduct in the first year 80% of free play tokens that are given out to players. And then it gets lower as you get closer to year 5, 80, 60, 30, 10, for example. And from the literature that I've seen, this is to introduce the market, to get people engaging with the market early on, and to then not penalize the licensee for essentially promotional tokens for their product that's being introduced to the market. The range of tax rate, oh, sorry, Senator Clarkson.
No. So I assume that players are taxed on their income, depending on how you do it. But also, aren't companies taxed on their income that you?
That depends on the state.
Okay.
So there are states that have expressly built into their statutory framework that the adjusted gross wagering receipts will be the only tax on that particular revenue stream for the licensee. That's not all states. So unhelpful answer, but it depends.
Got it.
And it's probably safe to say that most people who are betting online and winning, to the extent they're winning at all, aren't reporting those winnings as income.
Yes, and the payouts that a particular licensee is giving are also part of that record keeping and reporting aspect that we covered a few minutes ago. The
Right.
state will periodically get those records. They'll be subject to audit, and the state will understand based on those reporting logs who is getting the 200,000.
So let me back up. I mean, I know maybe I misspoke there, because now with legalized online betting, there is a way to report to the tax department what somebody's winnings are. If you go to a racetrack and you bet $2 to show on something and you get $2.50 back, there's no record of who they sold the ticket to and the earnings. But if you're cashing a ticket for $5,000 or $10,000, there is a detailed record, and it can get tracked by the IRS or the state tax department to make you declare that income. I don't know what these other states do. Are they trying to collect income tax on, I mean, I don't know, is that, and, I'm sure the public is not going to start saying, oh, now I got to keep track of every bet I make and declare it as income. So I don't know what the lay of the land is there, but
it varies, Senator Sorokin. And to go back to one of the record keeping points that I brought up for those retail locations, you'll see in states that there's different thresholds, but the most common one is a bet of $5,000 or $6,000 that retail location has to take down the personally identifiable information of the wagerer. So they're writing down their name, driver's license number, social security number, what have you. And, the primary goal there is to essentially track what would otherwise be potentially unusual wagering activities. That's usually what those things are targeting. But you do have a log of those larger transactions at the retail locations.
how are we doing time-wise, Tucker?
Well, Nancy's appeared, so we must be really,
We're right at the end here. We're right at the end. So this is not going to be helpful, but to give you an idea, the range of tax rates from state to state varies quite widely, and it runs from approximately 7% to 51%, depending on the individual state and their revenue model, whether it's revenue sharing, state run, or whether it's licensure. Tax rate also fluctuates depending on the size of the market and the number of licensees. Again, the margins for a lot of operators is very small. So if they have a lot of market competition and a higher tax rate, there's going to be less revenue available to the licensee. So manipulating the tax rate is going to be an important decision that you're going to have to tackle moving forward. And you'll see that in Graham's revenue section of the study. He goes into that pretty comprehensively, breaking down the term of art is the potential hold for a sports betting operator, and how Vermont is going to have to be somewhat tactical in evaluating what the potential hold is for a sports betting operator when you make the following decisions. How many licenses can be issued, what the fees are going to be for those licenses, and what the applicable tax rate is going to be. And a lot of that's going to be contingent. Those decisions are going to be contingent on what the potential market is in Vermont and how big that market could be.
Okay, so thank you very much, Tucker. That's helpful, intimidating in some ways. As I said before, some of you were on. We spent a great deal of time yesterday in finance dealing with the Cannabis Control Board and all the decisions they're facing. And they're pretty much very similar, projections on how many applications they're going to get, what the business model will be. They have all kinds of modeling things, and there are some hard decisions that the legislature's going to have to make. We've made many of them already, but over a multi-year process. And then there's a lot of things that are going to come forward in regulation through the Cannabis Control Board. So there's a lot of similarities here as we go forward. Just to ground us, I think despite the range of decisions that any legislation would have to make and how much it would be delegated to a board or to a department, um, we do have to keep in mind that the same thing that took place in marijuana or cannabis is here, is that the last I've heard, 140,000 Vermonters are playing these games, and there's a lot of revenue that's being lost to the state. And that's why when the Supreme Court ruled that states could do this so quickly, we have now 23 states doing it, and we're sort of coming in the middle of the pack. So there's good reason to at least consider this more thoroughly, but it's a heavy lift, and it may be a multi-year lift. Senator Brock.
I've heard a lot about this this morning, and I look at all the permutations and combinations that are possible in terms of decision making, and it reminds me a lot of what we talked about, as you mentioned yesterday, in finance. I'm just always concerned when we, as a state, tackle an issue of this degree of complexity, which is basically a financial issue to a great extent, notwithstanding the feelings that go along with it, philosophical feelings. But when we do it as a one-off, because we've never done it before, and the lack of experience that we have in doing it concerns me a bit. And that leads me to wonder whether or not Tucker, for example, has looked at how other states have arrived at the models that they've used and the decision-making that they've made. For example, are there consulting firms out there that states have used, in fact, in order to talk about and give them, from an informed perspective and a broad perspective, of the pluses and minuses of the individual decisions that they've made, in order to help them get where they're going from the basis of experience, rather than our best guess based on what we see at a distance? So that kind of is my question. And really what I'm leading to is, should we make this decision on our own on the basis of limited information, or should we consider retaining a consulting firm or firms that have done this in the past for others successfully?
Good question for us to think about.
I don't, go ahead, Tucker. I would guess there's a lot of consulting firms that have been in developing these models, but go ahead.
There are a few consulting firms that have evaluated the potential value of a sports betting market within a particular state. The caveat that I will throw out there is that most of those states already had regulated gambling systems. One of the reports that I cover in the study is a report that comes out every 8 years from a consulting firm that's commissioned by the state of Iowa. And it looks at, on one part, the potential revenue from these gaming systems and what has happened in the regulatory schemes over the last 8 years. And on the other side, the socioeconomic impacts of what those decisions are. There was supposed to be a report coming out in New Jersey that was going to be submitted to the governor. I cannot find the report, so I don't know if it has been completed or submitted. In late September, there was an analysis done for the state of New York, but recall that the regulatory scheme in New York had already been adopted by the time that fiscal analysis was commissioned and completed. So I would be happy to send you all of the firms in the various states that have done some of these studies. But again, many of them, the studies are done either after the regulations are put in place or studying existing regulated gambling markets in those states.
So I tend to agree, even though I'm a major proponent of this bill and have been, or this opening up the market. I hear what Senator Brock is saying. We now will have a written report with a lot of choices and flagging issues that we should be concerned about. What we don't have is at least recommendations from the executive branch or a consultant as to how Vermont factors in uniquely into these areas. I'm going to give the folks like DraftKings and FanDuel an opportunity to come in and say why they believe we could do this within the time frame we have. And if they can't convince us, I think that there are alternatives. I mean, I could see hiring a consultant, maybe establishing. I don't know what they did with cannabis. I can't remember. I know it took many years to get to where we are with cannabis, but we could potentially establish, even though it's an election year, a summer study committee of experts or legislators and tee it up better than it is right now for the upcoming session. I mean, realistically, that may be all we can do at this time. But let's give the advocates of the bill a chance to say, well, it sounds much more daunting than it is. But having gone through that here yesterday in finance, and there's been years going into to get us to that point, I don't think this is different. It's important that I sense there's support on the committee for eventually doing something, but we need to do it right. And we need
Well,
to
that's
take
the point that
necessary
I'm
time.
making is in terms of doing it right. When I see choices of a fee of $2,000 to $2 million, and many wide choices like that, it's thinking through all of those that are important and understanding the pros and cons of each decision and how they've applied and been applied in the real world. And that's what I'm really looking for in terms of the kinds of recommendations that would help us move forward.
Well, as a committee chair, I don't want to be involved in something, rushing something through that can't be done right. And in addition to the advocates for this, we also have the administration who's advocating for it. So let them come in and tell us why this is easier, or there's a transitional step we can take where we could do it in less than 2 committee hearings. It's a tough. Now, I do have one question for Tucker. Is he still with us? Tucker, are you familiar with what we did with what's the terminology for gambling?
Fantasy sports?
Fantasy sports. There you go.
Yes.
I know I'd always been concerned that there's 100,000 people playing fantasy sports, and the way we collected some revenue on that was just a licensing fee for people who wanted to run fantasy sports leagues and stuff like that. And I always was concerned, did we miss something here? Because people are making some money there, as gamblers or Vermonters are making some money there. Why we didn't tax their betting or their volume of fees that the consumer was paying. We just went after the licensee. And I understand New York went at it differently and was taken to court on that. But I hadn't heard the result of that court case. But I'm wondering if there is revenue to be had in that area as well in fantasy sports, other than small licensing fees we collect right now.
So fantasy sports wagering is regulated in Vermont's Title IX statutes. I don't know that it's licensed and regulated. I believe that you have to file and pay for a permit in order to offer daily fantasy. And I know the commissioner is here from TLL, but correct me if I'm wrong, Commissioner, but I believe that those are issued by DFR. Am I correct?
I don't know the answer to that, Tucker.
No, I think that's absolutely correct.
But I can.
Could the two of you maybe get back to us as to what the status of revenue collection is, not in Vermont, but in other states, which we've heard when we passed it, we've set a fee up somewhere in the middle. Can't remember if it was 50,000 or whatever, but
Yeah.
New York went the nuclear option, I guess I would say, of saying that it's not so much the fee, it's on each individual consumer of the program to pay something in, and that yields millions, not 50,000. And I always question why we didn't go for more there. And then I heard that New York tried that, and they were going to collect millions upon millions in fantasy sports, and they were taken to court. And I don't know what the status of that case is, or whether other states have gone that route. So if you can get back to us, a little research project, that'd be great. Okay, thank you so much. Very enlightening. And we'll see where we go from that.
Mr. Chair, Wendy has her hand up.
I'm sorry, Commissioner.
It's okay. I just wanted to add to your conversation about the consultants and Senator Brock was talking about. We do have consultants that advise us on the lottery side and that have a lot more technical knowledge about the sports betting. So I'm happy to offer them and connect you to them to bring them in as to help understand. Some of the consultants work with multiple states for numerous years, so they will have a lot of information to share on their experience working with other states.
Great. Well, we may have them in along with the advocates or the stakeholders on online sports betting. Okay, thank you all. We're going to move on to back to where we were Wednesday, I think, on finishing up on people we didn't get to on the omnibus housing bill, and they have the benefit of hearing all the other people and digesting some of what they've said. And I'm going to start off with Nancy Owens, who is the president of Ever North, which used to be Housing Vermont, right? And combined with sister agencies in other states, they are an incredibly important player in housing development in the state of Vermont, certainly in the nonprofit world. So I've heard Nancy testify before. She's great. And so I hope she can help us as we move towards putting pen to paper on ideas for our omnibus housing bill. Welcome, Nancy.
Hi, thank you very much for having me and making time for me today in your busy schedule. Yeah, as Michael said, I'm head of Ever North, which is a multi-state organization operating in Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont, and has been involved in, has 30 years experience financing and investing in affordable rental housing, really a focus on rental housing. And we currently have about close to 10,000 apartments in our portfolio across Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. And in Vermont, in particular, we're really busy these days and have, I think, close to 20 projects across the state that are in various stages of development. But we have two major roles, just as a background. We partner with nonprofit organizations, that you may be familiar with, like Champlain Housing Trust, Addison County Community Trust, Downstreet, Wyndham Windsor, and so forth, organizations like that to develop, own, and develop and own affordable rental housing. And then the other thing we do is we raise capital from investors, and that's primarily banks. So we raise those capital dollars from investors into funds, and then those funds are making large investments into the affordable rental housing in exchange for the low-income housing tax credit, which is the federal production program. That's the biggest production program in the nation. And so we have, over our 30 years, raised over $1 billion from bank investors that's been reinvested across the 3 states. I want to say I was able to hear a lot of the testimony on Wednesday. There was a really great conversation, and there's a lot of things I heard that I support and agree with. And maybe before I get to that, I just want to also just say, there's a lot of the word unprecedented has been used a lot over the last 1.5 or 2 years. This time is so strange, and but there's also some opportunity in the strangeness and in the crisis that we have with housing. In my career, which has been all in affordable housing, it really feels that there's more consensus and more understanding than there ever has been about housing is so interconnected to our lives, whether related to health, related to the economy, the workforce, all the things that without housing, are so impacted. And so I think about that housing has an elevated place in the conversation right now, and there is an opportunity in that to shift people's notions about the questions you've been discussing. Is how do we do it a little more quickly? I don't know about cost effectively, because costs right now feel a little out of our hands on some things, but certainly how can we increase production? Because that's what I kept hearing on Wednesday, and I think you were hearing as well, is the problem is production. And I've heard Eric Farrell speak before, and he mentioned, this thing he says, which is the people who show up to slow down housing are the people who already have homes. The people without homes are not the ones arriving at the zoning hearing and other things. But I think, even the people who have housing are being impacted by the housing crisis, right? They on the one hand, their homes are people who have homes, whether it's, especially, and they have home ownership, which is the vast majority of people in Vermont, their homes are appreciating in value, and that's, good news, right? That's something people are glad about and fortunate for. And you can't ignore the self-interest of homeowners, because homeownership is the largest asset that most people have, and we want to encourage that. But I also see those same homeowners, right? That same majority of people in Vermont, that their adult children aren't finding a place to live. That maybe their businesses can't grow. Maybe they're seeing businesses shutter in their community because those businesses are hampered. So there is, I don't know how we capitalize on that, but there is something in the messaging and the understanding, I think, that we need to try to capitalize on, that there's going to be changes in our communities in order to have that more production. And the changes this group has been talking about, I think, are ones that the state has been working on for decades and have done a great job on, which is this, again, there was a lot of conversation on Wednesday about housing and conservation and our downtowns and preventing sprawl and our work focusing on downtowns. And, Chris Cochran started out with, all of that and around. And those are things I absolutely support. We see as a development company, we see the benefits of the downtown program, the downtown credits, the neighborhood development areas, the work to eliminate the duplication of permitting, the incentives from a zoning perspective around the concentration of development. So I think that I'm looking back at my list, that focus that the state has had and continues to have and is contemplated in some of these other bills that have been discussed in the past are all ways that will help to increase production. That we've seen those things work, and more of that, more of clearing the way, anything that will clear the way for housing to be permitted more quickly in those areas that make sense, right? Those downtowns, village centers with water and sewer, with schools and sidewalks. And, the one topic around that's been talked a lot nationally, there's a lot of buzz about, and I hear it here in Vermont, and I know Maine is looking at the same thing, but it is this conversation around single family zoning, and how from a perspective of inclusion, that if you take a look at a village center or a downtown and the land mass where all of that infrastructure is located, the vast majority is restricted to single family homes. And so how can we open up that those areas and think about, we have underutilized space, and that's a change. When going back to the, I live in a single family neighborhood and in Burlington, and people have to think about, what does that mean if we start saying some parts of these neighborhoods, some parts of these streets can be densified, can allow for multifamily housing of some sort. Those are the kinds of changes I think we have to keep talking about and showing the positive impact of. Because we're certainly seeing the negative impact from a lack of housing. And I've had a lot of conversations over the past year with employers, and I'm working closely with a group of employers in the Upper Valley, because they're to help them construct a vehicle for them to make investment in housing, because they're so concerned that, and they're doing a lot of different innovative things to support their employees. But now they're actually looking at making an investment through Evernorth into affordable housing. So we have, the lack of production, or the production that hasn't kept pace with the need is a huge problem. And so zoning and permitting is the roadblock, is the, like, we have only so much land, only so much infrastructure, so many places where things can happen in a cost-effective way. And that is cost-effective, as opposed to being on the outskirts of town, or, you building septic systems, or trying to provide a well for multifamily housing and community water systems. Those are all expensive operations, both from an upfront cost and a long-term operation. So it's that concentration of housing, and we have a long history in Vermont that's enviable of doing that. And I just think we just have to double down and make those programs more expansive, more clear, invite more communities to be part of those programs, eliminate some of the barriers for some of the smaller communities, and continue to focus our efforts in that way. The other barrier is always money. And I know this isn't a money bill that you're talking about, but the infrastructure funds and the federal funds that are here, both at the state level and at the community level, I think as much as we can focus that lens of housing and the connectivity between housing and other investments, is an investment in a water system, or a stormwater system, or a roadway, or a broadband system, how is that also enabling and creating more opportunity for development of housing, right? How is that? Is there, I wonder about that. If even that question is asked, if even as a municipality is thinking about this investment in a related thing, will it enable more housing? Will it contribute to more housing? Because housing is connected to all those things. And the third thing I think about, beyond the money and the permitting and the programming, policy piece, is really on the affordable side. And I know we need housing not only for folks that Evernorth is serving, which is people, primarily people with incomes 80% and below is our range of housing, with a special focus at like 50 and 60%, but still doing some of that middle range housing, which in the Upper Valley, for example, we're talking about that would translate to an employee earning between $16 and $25 an hour is the focus range for that group that we're working on. But so thinking about that, those homes for folks at that income level, I just have to speak for a moment about the network, the housing network, some of whom folks you are familiar with, but the community housing organizations that produce and steward affordable housing are so essential, and Vermont has really an enviable network of developers and funding agencies and service providers and syndicators, which is my job, that really are very well coordinated. And tied to that is the longstanding policy that Vermont has had with regard to permanent affordability. And I would say Vermont, when you look across the nation, Vermont has done a better job than other states at preserving and sustaining the affordable housing over the long haul, because we came out the gate saying we're going to do permanent affordability. And other states, that's something maybe they achieved many years down the road. And as a result, what you can see is states are losing housing faster than they're building it. They're losing affordable housing faster than they're building it. They're not, the physical housing is still there, but it gets converted to market rate because of its opportunity, right? There's room to raise the rents much higher, because rents across the country have been escalating so much that someone who owns a property that has been affordable now can convert that to market rate. In Vermont, that's not happening because we said the housing must be permanently affordable. So the investment that the state made with its own dollars through VHCB and the state agencies and through the federal tax credits, those investments are not lost, and they're retained and they're stewarded by this network of nonprofit organizations. So I think when you think about production being part of the problem, one of the other bad symptoms in other locations is the loss of housing on top of a slow production. And in Vermont, we've been, because of these policies that were put in place a long time ago, we've done just a much better job than other states at preserving the housing investments we've made. And so we want to continue that pattern and that trend. So that commitment to permanent affordability is essential. And that includes, you know, I just think anything that you're looking at that aligns policies and new ideas, you know, through this network of VHFA and the Vermont Housing Conservation Board really pays back dividends. And I really just want to say, and I wish you were here to hear this, but that capacity in the past couple of years has been especially visible through Champlain Housing Trust. I know some of you are from the Chittenden County area, but I have been personally so impressed with CHT over the past couple of years as they have taken on such leadership in the state and in the housing network around the issue of homelessness. And this really, you know, Michael, I think probably did talk a little bit about the hotel purchases that they're doing and how both they're cost effective and quick, and they're resolving and supporting finding places for people who've been homeless to live. But they have taken on really material risk to do that. I mean, it's not, they've taken on substantive risk to do that, risk to their reputation about doing something new and fast in a challenging time, and risk to their own organizational capacity, and real, just basic fundamental real estate risk around some of that to do those renovations and convert them so quickly. And I just, that capacity, you know, that to me, the strength that CHT has is as an individual organization, but then also through the network to be supported and to share that information is just, for me, a real illustration of the value of something that Vermont has. It's not the same in New Hampshire and Maine. They have great developers and great both for-profit and community developers, but the collaboration and the consistency and the cohesion is not as clear in those states as it is in Vermont. And so I just think about CHT as like the largest housing organization. It can do more than most others, but I think about, like, what if every county's or every regional organization had the kind of strength, maybe at a different scale than CHD, that maybe more production could be happening. So I just think the network itself is a powerful tool.
Okay, does anybody have any, do you have more, Nancy? And I want to open it up to questions. I do have one myself. Just a
No, I'm
question.
happy to have any questions or.
Thank you. That was wonderful. I also want this question for Peter Gregory and any of the witnesses we had. In your connections around the country and what you're hearing, are we losing a lot of housing, permanent housing, to short-term rentals? And is there some sort of solution to that you hear about at all?
Yes, so short-term rentals is a topic of conversation among my peers across the country. It's a serious problem, and I'm looking at Senator Clarkson. I know, like in communities like Woodstock or Stowe or other resort areas, it's even more compounded, and it is another way that housing is lost out of the system. Right, it goes from being a house that's been contributing as a location for workers to live in, and so forth, to a business. The solutions that I've seen that seem to be most acceptable and productive, because are the ones where we're talking about at a smaller scale, owner-occupied type short-term rentals feels like a balance point that a lot of communities have come to, where those kind of short-term rentals could be allowed, because on the other hand, there are lots of people who having income like that enables them to stay in their home and stay in the community. I think it's the piece where there seems to be more consensus is around where entire buildings get taken out of the system, out of the housing system, and converted to short-term rentals, or where there's an owner who has multiple buildings and it's a whole business environment as opposed to a smaller scale.
That's one of the reasons I really want to explore promotion of the development of ADUs, because I could see, somebody wants to convert their house and they do the math, and they want to rent their house out and they want to turn it into a short-term rental, and they do the math and they think that's the only way they can go, is maybe moving out and turning that place into a short-term rental. But if it was really easy for them to convert part of their house, they could get some income at the same time and provide potentially an additional unit and keep living in it. So practically, I think an investment in things like ADUs from the state to make it really easy for someone's overhoused to build a unit in there. And that might require zoning changes as well on the state level too.
Right.
Senator Clarkson.
Yeah, no, I'd just like to build, because that was going to be my question, because Nancy gave us a big lead in her testimony into that in terms of losing housing. We don't just lose housing, we lose whole neighborhood feel. I mean, when you take out a full-time family that lives there, that has kids in the schools, that is a neighbor who gets to know the other neighbors. I mean, whole neighborhoods and communities are changing as a result of there being gutted of full-time people, whether they're renting or owning it. So short-term rentals aren't just having a huge impact on many of our gold towns in terms of losing housing, but we're losing the quality of our neighborhoods. We're losing big financial impact in terms of tax revenue of residents and kids in our schools. So we've got to figure out how to get a handle on understanding the financial and community impact of short-term rentals on our communities, in addition to the obviously loss of housing.
Yeah, and I don't know. I mean, to me, I wonder, is there a way to tax that kind of use differently so that those resources, if they are going to happen, if those activities are going to happen and that housing is lost, there is a public loss, as you just described, and we have, as I was talking about, infrastructure and buildable locations, right? We have a limited number of those spaces, and if we're not replacing those homes, the public has lost something. And so, can that use be taxed in a different way, and can that revenue be used to support, new housing to be built or other housing to be maintained or converted? And in terms of ADUs, yes, ADUs are great. There's been a lot of movement to increase the flexibility of allowing those in different locations. I think it's still a heavy lift for most homeowners to go through a permitting and construction, and it's a really heavy lift. And so, that's,
Right.
yeah,
Right.
that's just a challenge about how does that process get simplified enough that it's accessible for people to really achieve?
Right.
Well, we want to make
Well,
it,
it's time. I think the time has come. ADUs have been around for 15 years. We were ahead of the curve in the country. We first made them legal under conditional use, so we got our foot in the door. Now we need to provide some technical support and maybe some financial support to build upon those past laws.
Mhm.
Yeah. And just to tag on what you just said, Michael, I don't think building an ADU should be any more burdensome than turning a piece of your house into a short-term rental. I mean, because you're right, the plus of short-term rentals for some huge house owners who's still there as a solo person, and that makes great sense to help keep them in that house, which we shouldn't make it. I mean, they should be equally challenging. I mean, there's construction involved in both, but they should be equally, sort of more equal in terms of effort.
Okay, Nancy, thank you very much.
Nancy, that was great.
We're going to move on to one of my favorite planners, Peter
Yay!
Gregory, who I've worked with for decades. And one thing I could say about Peter is he's really grounded in looking at all sides of things and coming to thoughtful conclusions. So we're willing to hear if you have some creative ideas where we can go, and whether where we're going already is in the right direction.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. It's great to be back here, and I want to thank you for your past work on this issue. It's a huge crisis, has been for a long time, and mentioning the short-term rentals, that's just yet another hammer over our heads in dealing with the shortage of housing. So I want to also thank Nancy for her great work through the years and her partnership. I appreciate that. I'm Peter Gregory, Director of the Two Rivers Ataquiche Regional Commission. I'm here speaking, I think, generally for all regional planning commissions on most comments, except near the end where I'll have some suggestions that are my own. But I would like to say that Two Rivers has had a regional plan that I would consider pretty robust as far as anti-sprawl, and that comes into play in Act 250. Certainly, we've been very aggressive in that regard, and also in town plan approvals. We've been aggressive and have actually disapproved some town plans because they have not addressed housing adequately. So we have taken some tough positions. So I appreciate the committee's interest in dealing with housing from a smart growth perspective. That's the right thing to do. So I appreciate that. We've also conducted a multi-regional housing study in the Upper Valley, including the RPC on New Hampshire, where we've, of course, kind of identified the huge gap in numbers of units, but also the quality of housing certainly came out as a huge issue. So I just, it's not just the Upper Valley, but certainly it's one that we've studied extensively, and the quality of the existing housing stock certainly needs some attention. So very briefly, I'd like to say we all continue to support this committee's work on S101 and the version that did pass the Senate. We certainly hope that that can continue moving forward in the way you had intended initially. S79 is, I guess, now S210. Certainly Two Rivers testified in support of that last year, and certainly advocated with the governor's office not to veto that piece of legislation because we felt it was an important piece and hope that that can get across the finish line this year. I would like to just reiterate how important it is to adequately invest in the repairs that are needed when problems are identified. I know this is not a money committee, but the need for improvements in rental properties is so great that we want to make sure we have a registry that identifies problems, but then also has a mechanism to help fix those problems. And then finally, House 511, Representative Bongart's bill. We were involved in helping create that bill over the fall. We support that, and if this committee is so inclined and jurisdictional issues are worked out, we would love to see that part of your work so that can move as part of the omnibus. I think that we'll make some good changes. Again, a lot of them are small, but I think in total they continue moving the ball forward, and that's what we need to do. We've been in this business long enough that we don't always hit a home run, but if we continue to hit singles year after year after year, over time we're making some good headway. So let me now transition into some ideas that some you've heard before in the preceding couple of days from very good speakers, good thinkers that I will just indicate I support. And these are, again, not from all regional planning commissions, but from me. One is, as I think Nancy mentioned, you ought to take some testimony, if I may suggest, on prohibiting single family zoning in areas where there is infrastructure. Not a blanket prohibition of single family, because we don't want to incent multifamily in areas that are far from downtowns or far from infrastructure. So a very targeted approach, I think, is something that would be useful here in Vermont, would be smart growth, supportive, and then would get at the use of the infrastructure that the public sector has already invested in. So I think it's a time we really look at that. I know there's going to be immediate pushback from the usual groups and municipalities, but if this is a crisis, like I think we believe it is, we can't be timid in our suggestions and our responses. Second thing I would suggest that we all look at, the department as well as this committee, is the effectiveness of the bylaw modernization grants. We want to thank you for the effort and the legislature for the funding this year. But let's take a look at what actually occurs at the end of the round of grants that are out there to make sure that the municipalities are, one, adopting changes, and making sure, two, that the changes they're adopting are not just ineffective little tweaks, but real important things. I mean, we want to make sure that the public investment in this incentive program is actually working. I suspect it will be, but I want to make sure that we take a look at that. I think that's important. Third thing I'd mention is I think the legislature ought to look at providing some funding to the Department of Housing and Community Development to undertake a modernization of the planning side of Chapter 117. Title 24, Chapter 117 has got the planning side for municipal and regional plans and the bylaw side. I think there needs to be quite a bit of modernization on the planning side, certainly related to housing in your jurisdiction, but also on climate and other things. It's just woefully inadequate and not comprehensive enough, and does not address the things that are facing us today. So it's not a sexy thing, but it's not an expensive thing, but I think it's an important enabling change that we ought to look at. And then the issue of incenting behavior versus mandating behavior. This is always a tough one, given the political tradition of the Northeast and Vermont in particular. I've been doing this, as you know, a long time, and I've seen the results of incenting and enabling good planning behavior, and I've seen how it's gone and run its course and gone about as far as it is going to go. Even the bylaw modernization program, I mean, there were opportunities for decades to make changes that were effective in incenting more housing locally, but it never happened. We're lucky we have the funding right now to provide these incentives, but for those of us who have been around for a long time, we remember when budgets have been incredibly tight and we couldn't even do the basic human needs, much less things like incenting better bylaws. So I think we need to be, I think we need to really look at mandating if incentives are not working. I know there's a huge pushback on that, and the timing has to be right, but we need to have those discussions. And if we can't force it, maybe the state withholds certain dollars and grant programs to communities that refuse or are unable to make the changes that we know need to be made, especially since public tax dollars have gone into their downtowns, into their sewer systems and all that. It's just an ineffective and inefficient use of public tax dollars if we're sending money out the door here and not getting the results we as a state need. And then finally, ADUs and short-term rentals. Those are issues I think can be tweaked, and we stand ready to assist this committee if you get into those issues in a little more detail at some point. So with that, thank you for listening, and I'll take any questions you have.
That was great, Peter. So when you talk about incentives versus mandates, I thought this committee came up with a creative idea on bylaw changes last year. The league was opposed to it, but it was sort of a soft mandate where it said over 3 years, you had to make these changes, and then you could still get out if you wrote some sort of letter saying why it was difficult for, but you had an absolute right to get out. And did your group or planners support? I think we voted it out successfully, and it got watered down by the House, or maybe even before it got out of the Senate. Is that an approach you would have support?
Oh, I did. I certainly did support that. I suggested in testimony that the department actually be required to determine whether or not the out that a municipality sought was actually justified. The department didn't want to be in that position,
Right.
but simply writing a letter or something I didn't think was enough. But yes, I think that was the proper way to go. I mean, that was not.
That was sort of like a combination of incentive and
Right.
mandate, So-
Right. So it was very, very simple, very easy bar, but I think it would have effectuated some decent change on the ground over time.
Yeah.
So we may look at that again. Okay. Any other questions for Peter? I really appreciate that testimony, Peter and Nancy. And I'm glad I know it's going to be at the expense of our next few minutes, but it's good to have it on the heels of Wednesday's testimony and not let it just linger there. So I appreciate you coming in. And unless there are other questions, let's see what time it is now. We have about,
It's almost time for the floor. We have 10 minutes.
well, all right. So we
or
have
eight.
about 7 minutes. I'm going to move on to S210, and we do have the commissioner here. And I guess one thing that we could cover today that I'm a little concerned on, and you can refresh our memory, Commissioner, and it has to do with the VHIP program. So VHIP was established initially through CARES Act funds, correct?
Correct.
And there were paradigms or parameters to that program. And then last year, you came in with a request for $5 million, and we were all in. But we worked on some of the parameters of the program. And then the money passed, but the parameters of the program never got enacted into statute because they were in S79, and that was vetoed. So can you refresh our memory as to what, and you're all in going forward, that VHIP program. Can you just highlight for us, and maybe you could also put it in a memo, where you may have drafted that program or implemented and spent money on that program that might have been different from what the Senate did and what the House may have done? So we can, if we go forward and we're going to codify this program finally, we can know what you're doing different from what we had. And we spent time on it. We made some decisions where you, I know you, for the most part, you did follow our suggestions, but where it differs.
Sure. Just for the record, Josh Sanford, Commissioner of Housing and Community Development, and Sean is here as well in the details. I want to assure you that the ARPA VHIP dollars is exactly as the policy in S79. That's what we've rolled it out as. In fact, we've focused and doubled down on requiring it to be serving the homeless. So even stricter than the parameters in S79. But let me just go back and give a quick history. So we stood up the VHIP-like program with CARES Act funding, and we established the parameters through that process. And we spent $7.2 million on assisting units, bringing them online. And we have been able to achieve 251 units from that $7.2 million. And about half of them are serving folks exiting homelessness. That program we rolled out at the very beginning in very short order, because we only had about 8 months before Congress extended the CRF deadline. We weren't sure how the property owners, the landlords, were going to react to requiring them to serve homeless. So when we worked out that CRF program, we had a requirement that they at least take 3 applications from folks exiting homeless through the continuum of care organizations, and without a requirement that they actually end up choosing someone. But as we rolled that out and found that the uptick was, and the response was really welcomed, we doled out those CRF dollars in 2 batches. In the second batch, we put a requirement that they all had to go to folks exiting homelessness. And that's where we're at, that we finished the 251 units, about half served the homeless. And then last year, $5 million of ARPA funds were appropriated to continue the program. We essentially we increased the match requirement with those ARPA dollars by 10% to 20% to match what was in the S79 policy. And we started out with the requirement once again to see what the response would be from landlords to require that all these units go to folks exiting homelessness. And immediately the uptick was more than we had available. The 5 homeownership centers administering this program had requests that far exceeded the $5 million, even with that condition. And so we felt like we've honored the intent of the legislature through both programs, haven't varied from that at all. And we're using federal pandemic relief dollars, no state funds. And so the BAA quest is to continue that, the $20 million of ARPA funds, because it's a really tough for these homeownership centers to start and stop this program. They have to have staff, they have pipelines of applicants, and they've had to stop and start this program twice now when they have more requests and more people that we can house and need help. We're anticipating with this BAA request of bringing on more than 400 additional units online at a very cost-effective way. One thing that I will alert you to is that the first round we did very few ADUs because it was we were working very fast, and up to $30,000 does not seem to be enough money to really help establish a whole new apartment. What we are hearing is, as the easy apartments to bring online are addressed, if we want to do more ADUs, which are guaranteed to be long-term rentals, serving homeless folks and low-income folks, we need to be more flexible with these funds. And $30,000 wasn't what it could buy you 2 years ago. So the parameters that are in now S210 around VHIP, if you want to continue and do ADUs and do other things and use federal funds, we may want to revisit those maximums from what we're seeing on the ground. If you want to codify ongoing general fund state-supported program, it's completely reasonable to say, well, what do we really want to spend per unit? And to look at the ongoing life of a VHIP program from a lens of, are we using temporary pandemic relief funds or are we using ongoing general funds? And that the caps and the requirements could be different for depending on how you go forward there. The one thing I know, because I've heard it come up, is the RLF, homeownership RLF, that was also in S79. Now that was general fund, and we have not stood that up. We didn't feel we had the same level of authority to move that forward because it was vetoed and it was anticipated to be general fund. and to be honest and frank, for $1 million program, we've been moving tens of millions of dollars and had, our focus on the rental assistance program and VHIP and everything else. But it was less clear whether there was, full intent and support to use state dollars to move that forward program. So we have not at this point. But
That's a lot of information. It's good information. It's good to hear. We only have 2 minutes before we go on the floor. We're going to take this up again on Tuesday, just so the committee knows it's my intent next week sometime, and maybe as early as Tuesday, to put out 210. It's got to go to other committees. Most of it we've been through ad nauseum already. We're going to try and make some change to accommodate the veto, but we want to just get that moving. I just want to be clear. The budget adjustment request has $20 million more for VHIP that you think you can spend in the remaining 5 months of the year.
Well, Senator Sorokin, the ARPA funds are available through 2025. The reason it's requested now is we have immediate needs and a seamless way to continue to bring apartments online and to stop all the homeownership centers and let staff go to wait until, July 1 to start it over again. Just doesn't make sense.
$20 million doesn't have to be spent in the next 5 months, but you
Right. They have 3 years.
Okay.
3 years, but we want authority now because we've already allocated all the 5 million in this current budget year, and we want to work with all of the homeownership centers and landlords that have people waiting in the wings and keep bringing on units, because we still have over 2,000 families living in motels that are homeless.
Okay.
So,
But we really have to go on the floor, Senator Clarkson.
yeah,
So I'm sorry.
no, I was just, I'll email
Okay.
Josh.
Thank you, everybody. We'll see you guys next Tuesday. Thank you very much. Have a good weekend. Good holidays. Sorry, Sarah.
Stay warm.
We'll be right- Yep.